Most people believe that nations rise and fall because of elections, revolutions, or the decisions of famous leaders. But if you study modern economic history closely, you discover surprising truth. The world you live in, your job opportunities, your mortgage, your country's debt, the value of your money, your financial freedom, was not shaped in parliaments or presidential palaces. It was shaped in quiet rooms that most people will never see. These rooms are not full of politicians, but of analysts, not voters, but economists, not public debate, but private agreements. For the last 100 years, the most important ideas that govern the global economy, interest rates, globalization, deregulation, austerity, did not appear by chance. They were carefully created by organizations with no democratic mandate, no elections, and no obligation to show who funds them or why. These are think tanks. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history meet. Nothing is ever as simple as it seems. To understand how think tanks became the architects of the modern economy, we need to go back to a time when the world was rebuilding after disaster, the early 20th century. World War I had ended. The global financial system was shaky. Governments struggled to understand new economic realities they were never trained for. Modern bureaucracies were still young. Most governments did not have their own economists. They had no research divisions. They had no teams to analyze debt, productivity, trade, or taxes. This gap was filled by outsiders. In 1916, a small group of economists and philanthropists in Washington created the Brookings Institution, one of the first permanent non-governmental economic research centers. On the surface, Brookings looked like a normal academic organization, but from day one, it was connected to national decision-making. Its reports influenced budgets, wartime production, and early monetary policies. This model, private expertise guiding public policy, spread worldwide. After World War I and the failed Paris peace talks, another institution was founded, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also called Chatham House. Its goal seemed simple: gather politicians, diplomats, financiers, and scholars to discuss global issues in private. But in reality, Chatham House became a bridge between British elites and the world of global economics. By World War II, think tanks were no longer just academic projects. They became intelligence partners, strategic advisors, and the backbone of intellectual power shaping the century. Then came RAND, founded in 1948. It combined academia, military intelligence, computer modeling, and economic forecasting, something completely new. RAND didn't just study policy. It designed it. From nuclear strategy to game theory, from risk models to Cold War simulations, RAND shaped U.S. foreign and economic policy for decades. RAND became the model for future think tanks. By the 1970s, think tanks were multiplying across Washington, London, Brussels, and beyond. Hoover Institution, Carnegie, Council on Foreign Relations, AEI, Peterson Institute, Heritage Foundation. Each had its own ideology, funding, and goals. Each competed for the most valuable resource in politics: ideas. Politicians come and go. Think tanks do not. Administrations change every 4 or 8 years. Legislatures shift. Cabinets change. But think tanks remain, quietly shaping the intellectual framework that defines what leaders believe is possible or inevitable. This is how the global economic order was built, not by elections, but by shaping consensus. While voters debate personalities, think tanks debate principles. While citizens choose candidates, think tanks choose worldviews. While the public discusses policies, think tanks decide which policies should even be considered. To understand their influence, follow the money. Think tanks do not work alone. They are heavily funded by governments, corporations, defense contractors, billionaires, and foundations, all with financial interests. Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, Open Society, Wall Street banks, Lockheed, General Dynamics, energy companies, tech giants. Every major sector with something to gain is on the donor list. Though donations promise independence, the reality is different. Think tanks rarely publish reports against their donors' long-term interests. They don't need instructions. Funding naturally flows to those that already align with donors' views. Influence works through alignment, not orders. The economic ideas that gain traction and become common sense tend to match the interests of powerful donors. This is why the 1980s saw reports praising deregulation, financial liberalization, lower capital taxes, and privatization. It was not inevitable. It was planned by think tanks like Heritage, EI, and Cato, supported by corporate donors. Meanwhile, Brookings, CFR, Chatham House, and Peterson built the intellectual foundation of globalization: free capital movement, privatization, trade liberalization, and austerity as a solution to national debt. Think tanks didn't just influence policy. They created a worldview. Markets are rational, governments inefficient, globalization inevitable, inequality a necessary side effect. By the 1990s, think tanks were integrated into government. They provided cabinet members, central bank advisors, consultants, IMF negotiators, World Bank economists, and trade representatives. The revolving door was real. Work at Goldman Sachs, then Brookings, then Treasury, IMF, return to think tanks, then a regulatory commission overseeing industries you once worked in. This rotation ensures ideological continuity. No matter which party wins, economic policies remain similar because the creators of these policies remain the same. This is why the global financial system seems automatic. Policies stay consistent. Crises repeat. Mistakes reoccur. Only the faces change. Underneath, the intellectual framework is stable, built in places the public never sees. Think tanks are not just observers. They are narrators. They define the vocabulary politicians use, frameworks journalists rely on, and the stories investors follow when moving billions of dollars. Think tanks influence perception, not just policy, and perception drives financial systems. A report from Peterson or CFR warning of debt, slow growth, or needed reform spreads within hours. Media, cable news, politicians, central bankers. Suddenly a private idea becomes national concern. This is modern economic power, turning analysis into expectation, expectation into reality. When think tanks warn about inflation, markets react. When they call for austerity, governments adjust budgets. When they promote deregulation, capital flows faster. When they promote global trade agreements, industries reposition. They set the emotional tone of the global system without needing public approval. Their power comes from credibility, far more stable than elections. Influence can be direct, too. Chicago School economists, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, and their students reshaped global economics through research amplified by Hoover and AI. Free markets, deregulation, floating exchange rates, lower corporate taxes, privatization. These ideas became global orthodoxy. These ideas built Reaganomics, Thatcherism, and the Washington Consensus. Nations restructured based on frameworks from think tanks, not democracy. CFR shaped American foreign economic policy and post-war monetary order. Chatham House influenced Europe and Commonwealth trade, colonial transitions, and development. Heritage Foundation wrote parts of Reagan's economic agenda. Peterson shaped narratives around deficits and austerity in Latin America, Europe, and Asia. Davos, the World Economic Forum, doesn't create laws but builds consensus. CEOs, central bankers, and leaders align on risks, supply chains, demographics, digital currencies, and climate economics. Consensus shapes capital flows. Capital flows shape policy. Policy shapes lives of billions. Think tanks also influence one another, forming a global network of ideas. Brookings is cited by Chatham House, RAND by NATO, CFR by White House, Hoover by Congress, Peterson by IMF. These cross-references create the illusion of universal truth. When enough institutions agree, disagreement seems irrational. This cycle is powerful. Think tanks generate ideas, elites adopt them, markets expect them, governments act, original ideas reinforced. This feedback loop is efficient and hidden from the public. Economic policy often feels predetermined because the real debates happen behind closed doors years earlier. Monetary policy is a perfect example. Central banks are independent politically, but not intellectually. They study the same reports, attend the same conferences, follow decades of think tank research. If a think tank says inflation is rising, central banks react. If another says interest rates must remain high, markets adjust, and policymakers follow. Think tanks guide governments on digital currencies, inequality, and other policies. They act as the mental infrastructure of global finance. They define legitimate debates, determine real risks, elevate solutions, dismiss unrealistic ones. Economics is never neutral. It reflects choices shaped by incentives. Think tanks influence national priorities. Donors play a hidden role. A tech billionaire funds digital currency programs. Suddenly, research grows. Energy companies fund climate research. Certain models gain attention. Banks fund studies on capital flows. Deregulation ideas gain legitimacy. Donors don't need to give orders. They support experts who already agree. Their voices amplify until their ideas dominate. This sustains economic ideology. Today, think tanks affect everyday life. They shape media narratives on inflation, politicians' words on debt, and regulations affecting mortgages, investments, jobs, savings, and retirement. When think tanks support high interest rates to restore confidence, they affect your borrowing costs. When they support globalization, prices change. When they support austerity, public services shrink. When they support deregulation, your banks are affected. Think tanks shape not just policy, but your economic reality. The most powerful think tanks are invisible. They produce classified briefings, are quietly funded by corporations, draft white papers for G7, and influence IMF, World Bank, BS policies. They don't need publicity. Their power is behind the curtain. The lesson: the world is not shaped by left versus right or headline leaders. It is shaped by ideas refined, tested, packaged, and distributed by unelected institutions. Think tanks are idea factories. To understand a global economy and protect your finances, you must understand the machinery behind the story. Decisions about your money are not made only in parliaments or central banks. They are made in the intellectual infrastructure beneath them. History doesn't repeat, but frameworks do. If you don't understand who writes them, you will always react instead of anticipate. If this gave you new insight, subscribe. History has answers, and I'll show you where to look.